church. And so of all the works we do as a parish to spread the faith, the one that we invest the most time and money and energy into is our school. And it's really important. And so thank you for supporting that. And thank you to all the families here today that are here at the school. I want to thank our kids who read today. Our normal adult lectors are terrible, and so thank God we kicked them out and showed them up with little kids. Two things today I hope to open us up to. First, in this Eucharistic preaching series, I've thought sometimes we have questions about the Eucharist that don't always get answered. And so I want to do one of those really quickly and then jump into actually our second reading. As priests sometimes, and pretty frequently, we'll have people come to us and they'll say, either in the confessional or in our offices or somewhere else, people will say, well, Father Brian, I know I couldn't receive communion on Sunday, so I didn't go to Mass. And so there's people for one reason or another are unable to receive communion at Mass. And sometimes we might think, well, if I can't receive communion, what's the point? Why go to Mass? Has anybody ever thought that? Yeah, 5 of us. We've all thought that, haven't we? And I just want to explain this briefly to you. It's normal for us to think of Christianity as, wow, if I can't receive communion, then why am I going? The whole point is for Christ to enter into my life and for me to receive him body, blood, soul, and divinity in the Eucharist. And that indeed is the high point. But St. Thomas Aquinas answers this question extremely well. He got one right. I'm just kidding. But he answers this well, and here's what he says. He says that what God wants to do for every one of us is that he wants to teach us how to love him and how to worship him. And St. Thomas Aquinas, when he treats religion, he says religion is a virtue, and it's a virtue that fits under a bigger virtue. And the bigger virtue is justice. So what is justice? Justice means that you treat other people as they deserve to be treated. And we should all strive for that, to be men and women who treat other people as they deserve. So if you go to a restaurant and they undercharge you, you get your bill and you're like, wow, I must have spent $50 and your bill comes back as 20. I'm like, yes. All right, we're out of here. And Father Daniel's like, Larkin, we've got to pay that. We actually got undercharged. We should pay him. I'm like, you have fun with that. You pay the bill. Have a nice day. No, it's a really good thing when you and I are fair to other people. And what St. Thomas says is that religion, we could never give God what he deserves. It's impossible. How could I ever give God what he deserves from me? He gave me my life, my existence. He came and was made flesh for me. He died on the cross and rose from the dead for my eternal salvation. How could I ever give God what he deserves? I can't do it. But when we come to Mass, brothers and sisters, it's the closest we could ever come to that. It's the closest we could ever come to giving God what he deserves. Because here at Mass, through Jesus, in Jesus, and with Jesus, we're united to him and we offer the perfect sacrifice to the Father. And so if you come to Mass and you can't receive communion, some people get nervous and they think, is Father Brian judging me in his heart? Or are there people looking at me? And I just want to tell you what I think. If you're someone, you're coming to Mass and you can't receive communion, what I frequently think about people like that is that they're the best Catholics in the church. Because even though they can't receive, they love God and they show up every Sunday to worship him. And I find that beautiful and humbling. So if you are in a place where you can't receive communion, brothers and sisters, You belong here nevertheless every single Sunday. So I want to talk about our second reading. So we had a kid do it, right? I always feel bad for the grown men when they have to read Ephesians 5, right? The guys get up there and they're like, wives, be subordinate to your husbands as Christ, or as the church is to Christ. It's hard for them to read, so we make little girls read it. One time I had a wedding here, and this wonderful couple who goes to Lord's, and we used to have the couples during the readings sit right here between the altar and the pulpit over here. And the second reading was that reading. And I was sitting in the presider's chair, and I was trying to think straight about and make sure I had my homily together. And the reader gets up and reads the reading we had today. Wives, be subordinate to your husbands. And the bride flips around in her chair and gives me the evil eye. And we're in Mass, I'm not going to say anything, but I'm thinking, back off. You're not marrying me, you're marrying him. And after the wedding ended, it was a beautiful wedding, I found out that we actually put out the wrong reading. And she told me, she said, I've always struggled with that reading, but I think God wanted me to hear that, and it was providential that was read at my wedding. I don't know what you hear when you hear that reading. I think many of us, the first place our mind goes is to a bad husband who lords authority over his wife in the wrong way. And that's not what Paul is talking about. Paul assumes the husband in this reading, the Christian husband, is a man who lays his life down for his bride. But I don't want to talk about that today. At the end of the reading, what I think we should be drawn to think about first, at the end of the reading today, St. Paul says this. He says, "For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is a great mystery, and I mean in reference to Christ and the church." This is a great mystery, and I mean in reference to Christ and the church. Today I want to talk to you about how the Eucharist is the food of obedient love. The Eucharist is the food of obedient love. It's what it is. There's an old song, many of you will remember this, I think. It's probably 15 years old. I've preached on this song before, but there's an old song from the old Hellos. And in this song, it envisages the moment that Adam woke up on that Friday where God created Eve from his side. And so God puts Adam in Genesis 2 into a deep sleep. And he takes a rib from Adam's side and he forms Eve out of that rib. And the song quotes what Paul quotes here in Ephesians 5. But when Adam wakes up, he says, "At last." I just love those two words. At last, bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. I see that at weddings. At every wedding, I think I'm not going to cry. I always do. And the groom always stands right here when the bride comes down the aisle. And it's so powerful. And you can feel the groom as he watches his bride come through those doors, and his joy and amazement. And there's this moment of, at last, she's finally here. I've told this, all my stories are old at this time, but I remember in seminary, I was studying and I lived at Christ the King House. And one night I was out studying, and I wasn't in my collar, and I was getting close to finals, and I went out to a coffee shop, and I got like a tea or something, and I was studying kind of late. And at about 8 o'clock, everyone was gone. It was just me and the employees in the Starbucks. And I had like a decaf tea, and I'm just studying and reading. And the most beautiful woman I've ever seen in my entire life walked in. And in the Starbucks, they had on one wall, they had a row of tables. And it was those tables where there's only 2 chairs. And there's no one else there, and I'm sitting there, and this woman was just striking. She walked in, and she got whatever she ordered. And she went, there's lots of seating. She went 3 tables down from me and sat on the other side facing me. And I'm studying for the priesthood. I don't know what year I was, maybe second theology, something like that. And I'm reading my book, and you know what you do. You're reading your book, you're like, and then you make eye contact, you're like, and my heart started racing, and I was getting a little sweaty. And a true story, and I had to leave because I was so uncomfortable because she was so beautiful. And I always think whenever I tell that story that all the women at Lourdes are thinking in their minds, yeah, I remember that. That's right. Was that the Starbucks over at such and such a place? But here's what I want you to get from this. The early church, when the early church fathers talk about today's reading, and they think about Adam, and he wakes up and he sees his bride, right? In Genesis 2:24, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. The early church, because of what St. Paul does here in quoting that, the early church says that's not really a story about Adam. It's about him. And the fathers love to say that reading from Genesis 2 is a prophecy of Christ. And this whole reading is about the church as the bride of Christ. And so the fathers say, for this reason a man shall leave his father. Why did Jesus become a man? To find his bride. For this reason a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two become one flesh. Amen. Brothers and sisters, that's what will happen today at Mass. For this reason, a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his bride, and the two of them become one flesh. What does God want from us? It's so easy for us to think of Christianity as a system, as a moral law. It's easy for us to think of the church as simply a human institution. That is a lie from hell. The church is a woman. She has a heart. She has a body. She has a soul. And she loves her spouse. That's what the church is. And to be a real Catholic, you and I, we have to stop thinking of the church the way the world tells us to think of the church. The world tells us that when you think about the Catholic Church, the church is Pope Francis and Archbishop Aquila and Father Brian and those guys, and it's a bunch of celibate men in Rome. That is not the church. The Catholic Church is the new Eve. She is the bride of her divine spouse, and she loves him with everything she's got. And I want to make just one last point today. This reading from Ephesians 5, we always think about it in terms of human marriages, but Paul wants us to think about the marriage feast of the Lamb. You'll hear that today at Mass. Behold the Lamb of God, blessed are those who are called to the marriage supper of the Lamb. That's what Paul's talking about. And so today, in this reading, Paul talks about obedience. And here's what I want to challenge you to today in your life as a Catholic. It's very simple. Love makes you obedient. Love makes you obedient. There's a military type of obedience, and that is not Christian obedience. When you get married, a lot of my friends who are married, they always say this. When you get married, you surrender your life to your spouse. Not because they're going to punish you if they don't. They might. That's why I became a priest. But because you love them. And your children, you will never be so obedient as when you have children. And Christians, when we grow into the fullness of our faith, brothers and sisters, when we really get it, when we really understand what happens at this altar is that the crucifixion of Jesus Christ takes place. Our spouse lays his life down for us. He gives us everything, not just external gifts. He gives us his very self. How could you not love someone like that? How could you not love someone who gives their very life for you? If you want to grow in obedience, if you struggle with obedience, all of us do. I do sometimes. It's hard for me to be obedient to a lot of things in my life that I should. And that's a sign when that happens that I need to grow in love. Love always makes you obedient. And lastly today, one wonderful story of obedience. It's one of my favorites. You may have heard it from me, you may not have. But maybe my favorite story of obedience outside of Jesus's and Mary's. My favorite story of obedience is about Henry de Lubac. And Henry de Lubac, if you don't know him, is one of the great theologians of the 20th century. He was a profound thinker. He was a priest. He influenced much of modern theology. He brought the church back to an appreciation of the early fathers of the church. He did a lot of great things. At the height of his career as a theologian, there was a rumor and a misunderstanding, and his community, the Jesuits, thought that the Pope had condemned his teachings. And so they silenced him. And his whole life was about teaching and preaching and doing research and publishing papers and books. And at the height of his powers and the height of his career, the Jesuits silenced him. And so he could not teach. He could not teach publicly. He could not publish books. And at that moment, any one of us, myself certainly, I would just be angry. And maybe he was. In that period when he was silenced, he wrote this book. He knew he couldn't publish it. He was not allowed to publish it, but he wrote it anyways. This book is called The Splendor of the Church. The moment the church disciplined him and silenced him, he wrote the most important book on the Catholic Church of the 20th century in that field, in ecclesiology. And I want to read you just one passage with that in mind. De Lubac talks about the man of the church. And he's talking about what we're talking about today. That if you're going to be a real Catholic, it means that you love. It means that you give yourself in the way that the church gives herself to Christ. And de Lubac says this: he says, a man of the church will have fallen in love with the beauty of the house of God. The church will have stolen his heart. The world doesn't get that, does it? The world thinks that all Catholics just thought through a system and came to a logical conclusion. That's not Catholicism. The church will have stolen his heart. She is his spiritual native country, his mother and his brethren. Nothing that concerns her will leave him indifferent or detached. He will root himself in the church's soil, form himself in her likeness, and make himself one with her experience. He will feel himself rich with her wealth. Does this sound like a man who is bitter because the church silenced him? It will be from her that he learns how to live and how to die. And this is the most powerful part of this section. Far from passing judgment on her, he will allow her to judge him. Far from passing judgment on her, he will allow her to judge him. Brothers and sisters, the Eucharist is not just a divine miracle. It is. It is not just God's presence among us. It is. The Eucharist is spousal. It's the heart of a groom for his bride, the church. Today, when you receive communion, or if you can't, Christ's love is for you, his bride. When you receive that, pray that he would give you a heart that is truly obedient.